Sign or get out. My husband mocked, waving papers in the house I fully paid for, as if the walls themselves would bend to his lies. He stood there with a smirk stretched so confidently across his face that for a moment, I wondered if he genuinely believed his own performance. The papers shook slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the excitement of a man who thought he had already won. A man who thought a single signature would erase 4 years of my sacrifice, my work, my inheritance, my home. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I watched him the same way one might watch an actor stumble through a script they barely understood, knowing the ending, knowing the twist he couldn't see coming. The house smelled like fresh coffee from the machine he didn't know how to operate, the one I'd purchased when I landed my first 7-figure contract. Sunlight streamed in through the windows he always kept shut. He said the brightness gave him headaches, but really, it just made it harder for him to hide the truth. His voice grew sharper as he stepped closer. Cassidy, stop making this difficult. We both know the house belongs to us now. Marriage is partnership. 50-50. I looked at him, at the man who never paid a single mortgage bill, never contributed to a single repair, never even took out the trash without being reminded. A man who called himself a provider but couldn't provide proof of a single paycheck. He truly didn't understand what he'd just started. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here to share stories of women reclaiming their power. If you believe self-respect matters more than empty promises, please consider subscribing. It's free, and it helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now, let's see how this unfolds. I finally stepped forward, not to take the pen he thrust at me, but to examine the documents he'd prepared so proudly. The legal jargon was messy, inaccurate, clearly pulled from some online template he barely understood. He had highlighted entire sections as if that made them true, as if yellow ink could transform fiction into law. This isn't how property works, Blake, I said calmly. Premarital assets don't become joint just because you lived here. His jaw tightened. My attorney said. Your attorney advertises on bus benches. His face flickered, just for a moment, with the first hint of panic. But he masked it quickly under that same arrogant smirk, the one he wore the first time he'd ever told me he was proud of my success, right before asking me to fund his newest business venture. He thought I was cornered. He thought his threats, his rehearsed lines, his paperwork would intimidate me into surrender. He thought that by raising his voice, by pointing to the door, by pretending to hold power he never earned, he could force me out of the home I built long before he entered my life. But I had already seen the missing pieces, the misplaced documents in my office, the bank statements with unfamiliar charges, the attorney consultations he thought I wouldn't notice. This wasn't about a house. This was a takeover attempt. Sloppy. Desperate. And already falling apart. So when I finally reached for the pen, his entire body relaxed. He thought he'd won. And that's when everything truly began. I placed the pen back down, watching Blake's confidence flicker like a candle exposed to wind. He took a shaky breath, stepping into a role he had rehearsed for weeks, maybe months, armed with legal buzzwords he didn't fully understand. Cassidy, stop dragging this out, he insisted, pacing with the bravado of a man convinced the law favored whoever spoke louder. You know the court will see my contributions. I maintained our home. I supported your career. I sacrificed everything for us. His words were so carefully practiced that I wondered how many times he'd stood in the mirror reciting them to himself, tilting his chin, adjusting his tone, perfecting his victim act. The man who couldn't load a dishwasher without calling me for help now spoke as if he'd been carrying the weight of our household on his shoulders. Sacrifice? I echoed, lifting my eyes to him. Blake, you didn't sacrifice your career, you never had one. He stiffened. A crack in the performance. I pointed at the stack of documents he had rearranged earlier in my office, the ones he snooped through while pretending to help. You were living in your brother's basement when we met. I built everything you see in this house, every wall, every fixture, every payment, every repair. He swallowed, but the arrogance returned quickly, like armor he refused to remove. Marriage makes it joint. My attorney said so. Your attorney, I repeated slowly, was suspended twice. Once for filing fraudulent paperwork. Did he tell you that? Blake blinked. He hadn't known. He hadn't checked. He'd hired the first man who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. He straightened, masking embarrassment with anger. It doesn't matter. You put money into the joint account. That's commingling. That means the house is marital property. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because his ignorance was so predictable it felt scripted. Household expenses aren't commingling, Blake. Every attorney knows that. Even yours should know that. His nostrils flared. You think you're smarter than me? I don't think, I corrected softly. I know. He slammed his palm against the table again. Stop acting like I'm the enemy, Cassidy. I've contributed to this marriage. While you were building your business, I handled the home. That counts. The words echoed off the walls of the kitchen he never cooked in, never cleaned, never repaired. I remembered every contractor I'd hired to fix what he ignored. Every grocery bill I paid while he bought supplements and protein powder on my corporate card. Every night he disappeared to network, returning smelling of cologne that wasn't mine. That's what you told your attorney? I asked quietly. That you maintained our home? His silence was answer enough. I walked past him to the window, letting sunlight spill into the room. The brightness illuminated the truth he'd tried so hard to bury under his performance. You don't want the house, I said slowly. You want the lifestyle. The image. The luxury. You want the version of yourself you only have when you're standing next to me. His expression crumpled, confusion and anger mixing into something fragile. I turned back to him. But Blake, you can't keep what you never built. And for the first time since he'd waved those papers in my face, he realized the ground he stood on wasn't solid. It was quicksand. And he was already sinking. Blake's jaw tightened as if he could clench the world back into his control. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like he believed intimidation counted as negotiation. You're not listening, Cassidy. I deserve something. 4 years of my life, gone. You owe me for that. I owe you? The words tasted sharp, almost metallic. I moved around the table, picking up the mortgage documents he'd scattered earlier, documents stamped with dates long before Blake ever existed in my life. You moved into a fully paid home. You lived off my income. You used my corporate card like it was an allowance. And you think I owe you? His mouth opened, but nothing convincing came out. Instead, he pointed at random files as if grabbing for a lifeline. These deposits, money you transferred into the joint account, those count as contributions to marital assets. That makes the house ours. I shook my head slowly, pity mixing with disbelief. Those were household expenses. Food. Utilities. The cleaning service. All things I paid for. Things you never even noticed unless they made your life easier. His face reddened. My attorney said. Your attorney, I interrupted gently, Google's legal terms between clients. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but his ego forced him to push on. Even if the house is separate property, I still get half of your business. We built your company together. We? I almost whispered it. He lifted his chin proudly. I inspired you. I supported you. I was your emotional anchor. The sentence was so absurd I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Emotional anchor? Blake had been an anchor, yes, but the kind that dragged ships to the bottom of the ocean. Blake, I said softly, you don't know the first thing about my business. You've never attended a meeting. Never reviewed a contract. Never built a strategy. You don't even know the names of my clients. That's not the point, he snapped. Being married means I'm entitled to half. Not when the business was incorporated before we married, I corrected. Not when every account, contract, and tax document is in my name alone. Not when you've contributed nothing. He flinched. Nothing. That word landed like a slap. He grabbed the back of a chair, knuckles whitening. You can't just erase me like that. I gave you my time, my energy, my dreams. Your dreams, I echoed. Blake, your dreams changed every 6 months. First you were a consultant. Then an entrepreneur. Then an app developer. Then an investment coach. And every time you failed, I paid the bill. He stepped forward again. I was trying. You don't get to judge my progress. Progress. A funny word coming from a man whose biggest achievement was creating vision boards for businesses he never started. You weren't trying, I said. You were waiting. Waiting for the moment you thought you could take what I built. His breathing grew louder, uneven, the facade cracking line by line. This isn't over, he whispered, half threat, half plea. But the moment he said it, I saw something shift inside him. A flicker of realization. A tremor of fear. Because for the first time, Blake understood something he had never allowed himself to believe. He was not the mastermind of this story. He was the man who had just lost control of a game he never knew the rules to. Blake's confidence finally cracked when he saw I wasn't reacting, not with fear, not with shock, not with the panic he expected. I'd spent years letting him believe his anger could move me, bend me, reshape me. But that version of me was gone. And the stillness in my eyes made him step back, just half an inch, but enough. What did you do? He demanded. I slipped the folder he'd given me across the table and opened it again, slowly, deliberately. You want honesty? Fine. Let's talk about what you did. He swallowed hard. You hired an attorney 3 weeks ago, I said calmly. You tried to access my corporate files. You met with a real estate valuator. You asked my mother about my father's cabin. You even made calls about my grandmother's jewelry. His face drained of color. He hadn't expected me to know any of that. How do you know that? He stammered. Because I pay attention, Blake, I replied. Something you never learned how to do. He blinked rapidly, trying to regain footing. I was gathering information, just being responsible. You were preparing to strip me of everything, I corrected. And you were sloppy. Very, very sloppy. I moved toward the window, letting the silence stretch just enough for him to feel it. You didn't think I'd notice missing documents. Or missing jewelry. Or the fact that your sudden interest in marital property law appeared exactly when Jessica Reeves showed up wearing my bracelet. Blake's mouth fell open. Jessica? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me, I said gently. You were seen. Filmed. Documented. You weren't discreet. You weren't strategic. You weren't even original. You were predictable. His eyes darted toward the kitchen doorway, like he was looking for an escape route from a conversation he'd started. "You think you're so smart," he hissed. "You think you're always one step ahead." "I don't think it," I replied. "I know it." His jaw twitched. Rage simmered beneath his skin, a heat he couldn't contain. "This is why we're here. You love control. You love power. You don't know how to be a wife. And you don't know how to be a partner," I cut in. "You wanted a sponsor, not a marriage. A lifestyle, not a life. A house, not a home." I walked back to the table and placed my hand on the deed, the one dated years before he ever touched my life. "You planned a takeover," I said. "You rehearsed speeches, staged documents, created false narratives. And you really believed I wouldn't understand what you were doing." Blake's voice cracked. I needed security." "You had security," I said softly. "You had love, stability, comfort. But entitlement made you greedy. And greed made you stupid." He opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a shallow breath, like he'd been punched. I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "You thought you were the wolf in this story. But you were the man who walked into a courtroom without knowing where the door was." Blake stared at me with a mixture of fear and realization, the beginning of understanding that the game he tried to play was already over. Blake's breathing grew uneven, like each inhale was a struggle against the truth closing in on him. He backed toward the counter, gripping the edge as if the granite might save him. For the first time, he seemed to realize this wasn't a negotiation, wasn't a debate, wasn't even a marital argument. This was exposure. And he was naked in the brightest light he'd ever stood under. "You think you can just walk away with everything," he spat, desperation now leaking through every syllable. "You think the world will believe your version?" I tilted my head. "The world doesn't need to believe me. The law does. And the law already has documents, recordings, screenshots, witness statements, timestamps, bank records." I shrugged lightly. "Evidence tells the story. Not you." He sputtered. You trapped me." "No," I said softly. "You trapped yourself." I moved past him and set my phone on the table, screen still recording, visible, undeniable. His eyes widened. "You recorded this," he whispered. "Blake, Missouri is a one-party consent state. You announced your intentions. You threatened eviction from a property you don't own. You demanded assets you have no legal right to. You demonstrated full knowledge that the trust predated our marriage." I paused, letting each word settle. "Every sentence you speak digs the hole deeper." His hand shook as he ran it through his hair. "This isn't fair. I contributed. I gave you emotional support." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you told your attorney? That your emotional labor entitles you to my inheritance, my company, my father's cabin, my grandmother's jewelry?" I stepped closer. "Tell me, Blake, how many of those emotional support sessions did you give Jessica while wearing my Rolex?" He flinched. There it was. Truth stripped bare. "You went through my things," I continued. "You stole from me. You pawned heirlooms. You funneled money into a private account. You lied to my family. You lied to me. And you would have kept lying if you thought you could walk away wealthier." His voice cracked. "I was scared, okay? You were always ahead of me. Always achieving. Always winning. I needed something that felt like mine." "You could have built something," I replied. "But you chose to take something." His shoulders sagged. The bravado drained out of him, leaving a man I barely recognized, small, panicked, cornered by his own choices. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." I held his gaze, unwavering. "You didn't think I'd wake up." He sank into the dining chair, burying his face in his hands. "So what now? You ruin me? You just cast me aside?" I exhaled slowly, not with anger, but clarity. "No, Blake. Ruin isn't something I have to do to you. You already did it to yourself. I'm just stepping out of the way." He looked up, eyes wild. "Cassidy, I have nowhere to go." "You have 72 hours, I said calmly. "My attorney has already been contacted. The sheriff will supervise the move. Everything you legally own will go with you. Everything you tried to steal stays here." His lip trembled, not in remorse, but in humiliation. The collapse of the narrative he'd built. The end of the fantasy where he imagined he held power over me. I picked up the keys from the table and slipped them into my purse. "Blake," I said quietly, pausing at the doorway, "this house was never your empire. You just mistook my generosity for weakness." And for the first time, he finally understood the difference. I left him sitting there, small, silent, and stunned, while the home he once tried to claim pulsed with a clarity that had been missing for years. Outside, the evening air felt cooler, lighter, almost celebratory. It wasn't freedom I felt at that moment. It was reclamation. The rebuilding of a woman he underestimated, piece by piece, breath by breath. I drove straight to Rachel's office, where the city lights glittered against the glass like they were applauding. She already had the paperwork ready: fraud documentation, the trust reaffirmation, the eviction timeline, and Blake's own signed confession masquerading as a separation agreement. His signature wasn't a threat anymore. It was evidence. By the next morning, the legal machinery was already in motion. Blake's access to my accounts was cut. His corporate card cancelled. His car repossessed. His phone disconnected. His gym membership declined at check-in. Every thread he had woven into my life unraveled the moment I stopped holding it in place. And he felt it, every snap, every break, every consequence he once believed he'd never face. When the sheriff arrived to serve the official notice, Blake looked more like a man waking from a dream than living in reality. His eyes darted between the officer, the papers, and the house he thought he could bully into claiming. "There must be a mistake," he pleaded. But there was no mistake. Not anymore. His attorney had all but confirmed his ruin. And the neighbors watched from behind curtains as the illusion of Blake's power collapsed under the weight of truth. Over the next 48 hours, he shuffled through the rooms, collecting his belongings, what little of them truly belonged to him. Each item carried the quiet humiliation of a man forced to confront how little he had contributed to the life he tried to seize. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the man who once waved papers in my face saying, "Sign or get out." Now he was the one walking out, cardboard boxes in shaking hands, escorted by the very legal system he thought he could manipulate. When the locks were finally changed and the door clicked shut behind him, the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. My home exhaled as if finally relieved to belong to its rightful owner again. I opened the curtains Blake always kept drawn, letting sunlight spill into the space he once darkened. This time, the light stayed. And for the first time in years, I felt the warmth reach every corner of my life, not because Blake was gone, but because I was finally present. Weeks later, when I hosted a dinner with the people who had stood beside me, Emma, Rachel, my sister, my grandmother's crystal sparkled on the table, the same table Blake had tried to claim as marital property. We laughed, We shared stories, and my house, my real house, felt alive in a way it never had when he was inside it. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need destruction. I only needed truth. And truth had done the rest. As I raised my glass, the room fell quiet. Not heavy, hopeful. Strong. Reclaimed. If this story of earned justice had you hooked from beginning to end, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Blake's attorney screamed, "Do you have any idea what you just let her do?" What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.